There is a moment that happens before every war, before the first soldier crosses a border, before the first missile is launched, before the world watches in disbelief and asks, "How did we get here?" There is a moment no camera captures, no press conference, no public statement, no roaring crowd, just a room, maybe quiet, maybe cold, and a person sitting inside it holding the weight of a decision that once made cannot be taken back. And here is what most people never consider. In that moment, the leader sitting in that room does not think, "I'm about to start a war." They do not think, "I am choosing destruction." They are not rubbing their hands together in some cartoon version of evil. They think something far more ordinary, far more human. They think, "I am protecting my people." And that is precisely what makes it so dangerous, because the road to catastrophe is rarely paved with obvious malice. It is paved with psychological patterns. Patterns that researchers have studied for decades. Patterns that exist inside all of us, but that become terrifyingly amplified when one person holds the fate of millions in their hands. So today, we are going inside that room. We are going to explore the actual psychology of how leaders arrive at the decision to go to war. Not through ideology, not through politics, but through the lens of cognitive science, social psychology, and historical behavior. This is not a political video. It is a psychological one. And what you are about to learn about world leaders, you may recognize in yourself. The illusion of control at the top. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted what became one of the most disturbing experiments in the history of social science. In the Stanford prison experiment, ordinary college students were randomly assigned roles as either guards or prisoners. Within days, the students playing guards began behaving with aggression and dominance, not because they were cruel people, but because the role itself changed how they perceived reality. Power changes cognition. That is not a metaphor. It is a measurable neurological shift. Research published by psychologist Dasher Keltner at the University of California, Berkeley, found that people who occupy positions of high power show reduced activity in the mirror neuron system, the part of the brain responsible for empathy and reading the emotions of others. Power, over time, literally narrows the way a person perceives the world around them. And it does something else. It creates what psychologists call the illusion of control. The more authority someone accumulates, the more they come to believe they can manage outcomes. They begin to feel that escalation can be regulated, that risk can be calculated in advance, that consequences, even catastrophic ones, can be contained if the right moves are made at the right time. A leader preparing for military action does not imagine uncontrollable chaos. They imagine a precise operation, a defined mission, a beginning, middle, and end. But war is not a chess game. It never has been. Military strategist Karl von Clausewitz described it in the early 1800s as the realm of chance and friction, where nothing unfolds as planned and every action generates unpredictable reactions. His insight has been validated by every major conflict in modern history. Yet the leader in that quiet room still feels, on some deep cognitive level, that they can shape what happens, that they can manage the outcome. And that belief feels completely rational, even when the historical evidence says otherwise. When fear becomes the trigger, here is something that might surprise you. Most wars do not begin with aggression. Most wars begin with fear. Not fear in the way we usually imagine it, with trembling hands and wide eyes, but a far more dangerous kind. A cold, calculated, strategic fear. The kind that feels like logic. Psychologist Robert Jervis, in his landmark 1976 book, Perception and Misperception in International Politics, documented how leaders consistently misread the intentions of adversaries. They interpret ambiguous signals as hostile. They assume the worst-case scenario is the most likely one. And they make decisions based not on what is actually happening, but on what their fear tells them might be happening. The thinking begins to sound like this. If we do not act now, we lose our window of advantage. If we hesitate, we will appear weak. If we wait for certainty, it will be too late to act at all. This is not irrational thinking. In evolutionary terms, it makes perfect sense. The human brain, as neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux has extensively documented, is wired to respond to perceived threats before they are fully confirmed. Our amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, can trigger a fear response before our prefrontal cortex, the rational decision-making center, has even fully processed the incoming information. In other words, we are biologically built to act on incomplete information when the stakes feel high enough. Now scale that biology to the leadership of a nuclear-armed nation. Under prolonged pressure and chronic stress, the prefrontal cortex begins to lose its regulatory influence over the amygdala. Cognitive tunneling occurs. The brain becomes less capable of entertaining nuance, less patient with uncertainty, and more prone to seeing threats in neutral actions. Psychologists call this threat inflation. Neutral behaviors by an adversary begin to look deliberate. Diplomatic caution starts to look like weakness. Ambiguity becomes danger. And then the question that drives history begins to change. It is no longer, is this threat real? It becomes, what if we are wrong and it is? That single cognitive shift from probability to possibility has preceded some of the most devastating conflicts in recorded history. And it happens not in war rooms filled with weapons, but inside minds filled with fear dressed up as strategy. Status, ego, and the fear of looking weak. There is a third force at work in that quiet room, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable one to acknowledge. Ego. Not loud, boisterous ego, not the kind you can point to and name easily, but the quiet, persistent, deeply human need to not be humiliated. Social psychologist Henry Tajfel's foundational research on social identity theory, developed in the 1970s and extensively expanded since, demonstrated that people derive a significant part of their self-worth from the groups they belong to. When the group is threatened or dishonored, the individual experiences it as a personal attack. Now apply that to a national leader. Nations have status in the international order. They have perceived strength. They have a position in a hierarchy that the leader did not just inherit, but in many cases spent decades building or defending. When that status is challenged, the psychological response mirrors what happens to any individual who feels disrespected. Research by social psychologist Roy Baumeister found that threatened ego is one of the most reliable predictors of aggression in human behavior. Not low self-esteem, threatened self-esteem. The feeling that a carefully constructed image of strength and competence is being undermined. A leader in this position may not consciously think, "I want dominance." The internal voice is subtler than that. It says, "I cannot allow my nation to look weak." It says, "If I back down from this, I will be seen as the one who blinked." It says, "Compromise right now will be read as surrender." And then something even more powerful enters the psychological equation: legacy. Research on what psychologists call mortality salience, the awareness of one's eventual death, consistently shows that when people are reminded of their mortality, they cling more tightly to their symbolic legacies. They become more willing to take extreme actions to secure how they will be remembered. Leaders are not immune to this. Many are acutely aware of their place in history. Some are obsessed with it. And when a leader begins to frame a decision not just in terms of current outcomes but in terms of historical legacy, the psychological calculus changes entirely. The internal question shifts from, "Is this the right decision?" to, "Is this the decision history will respect?" And ego, combined with that question, is extraordinarily dangerous. The information bubble at the summit of power here is a truth that cuts across political systems, democracies, autocracies, and everything in between. The higher someone rises in power, the more distorted their information environment becomes. This is not always the result of corruption or deception, though those certainly occur. More often, it is the predictable outcome of ordinary human behavior around power. People protect their access to powerful figures by softening bad news. Advisors learn to frame dissent carefully, or not at all, if they want to remain in the room. Intelligence reports get filtered through layers of bureaucracy, each layer applying its own interpretation. By the time information reaches the top, it has often been unconsciously shaped to reflect what those below believe the leader wants to hear. This phenomenon has a name in organizational psychology. It is called the mum effect. People stay quiet about negative information when delivering it might upset a powerful person or jeopardize their own position. Columbia University researcher Robert Jackal documented this extensively in his study of corporate hierarchies, but the pattern scales directly to political power. The result is what scholars call strategic sycophancy. The leader hears more agreement than disagreement. Warnings get diluted. Alternative scenarios get dismissed before they reach the top. And over time, the options that the leader perceives as available begin to narrow, not because other options do not exist, but because the information environment has been quietly reshaped around the leader's existing beliefs. Irving Janis, the Yale psychologist who coined the term groupthink in 1972 after studying decision-making failures including the Bay of Pigs invasion, found that cohesive groups of powerful advisors consistently suppress doubt in order to maintain the appearance of unanimity. When everyone in the room appears aligned, action feels not just justified, but inevitable. The dangerous irony is this. The leader often feels most confident, most certain, most clear-headed at precisely the moment when their information environment is most distorted. How the mind rewrites morality. No leader in modern history has announced a war by saying, "We are doing this for selfish reasons." The language is always moral. This is not purely cynical propaganda, though propaganda certainly plays a role. It also reflects a genuine psychological process that researchers call moral disengagement, a concept developed extensively by Albert Bandura, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. Bandura found that people do not simply abandon their moral values when they take harmful actions. Instead, they construct cognitive justifications that reframe those actions as not just acceptable, but necessary, even virtuous. The mechanism works something like this. Attack gets reframed as preemptive defense. Force gets reframed as protection of the innocent. Escalation gets reframed as the restoration of stability. Offensive military action gets reframed as the prevention of something worse. And crucially, the leader is often not consciously aware of how thoroughly this reframing has occurred. The mind is extraordinarily skilled at constructing coherent moral narratives around decisions that were initially driven by fear, ego, or political pressure. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt's research on moral reasoning found that humans typically arrive at moral conclusions emotionally and intuitively first, and then construct rational justifications afterward. We do not reason our way to moral beliefs. We feel our way there, and then build the case to support what we already believe. When a leader has already made the psychological commitment toward military action, the moral architecture begins to assemble itself automatically. Necessity becomes the cornerstone, and necessity is one of the most powerful silencers of ethical hesitation in the entire catalog of human psychology. The action feels not just permissible, it feels obligatory. The escalation trap and the sunk cost. Once the machinery of military preparation begins moving, stopping it becomes exponentially harder. And this is not weakness or corruption. It is a deeply documented psychological phenomenon. Behavioral economists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, through decades of research that ultimately earned Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, demonstrated that human beings weigh losses far more heavily than equivalent gains. We are not rational calculators. We are loss-averse creatures. And once resources have been committed, once public statements have been made, once expectations have been raised among allies and citizens, retreating from the path toward conflict begins to feel psychologically catastrophic, even when continued escalation is objectively more dangerous.